Welcome to Obi-Wan Church. It's good to have you today. If you don't know me yet, my name is Chris. I'm one of the pastors here, and it's my privilege to share with you today. As we get started, I want you to think of a time in your life where someone gave you grace. You didn't deserve it. You didn't. You could just, in your mind, you didn't deserve it, whether it was a parent, a friend, a teacher, a boss, a peer, sometime in your life where you got grace. As you're thinking about that, I want to share a time in my life. When I was in college, I had this very exhilarating class called business law. Yeah, very exhilarating, right? It was so exhilarating that I oftentimes chose to sleep through the class instead of go to the class. Well, I looked up on my syllabus and I was like, and we were a couple days away from a test, and I was thinking to myself, should I go to this class or should I just sleep in and then we'll take the test next week? I can just get some notes from my buddy about what's going to be emphasized on the test. And I did the proper thing, which is sleep in and not go to the class. Obviously, I'm teasing. And I went to my buddy because I had another class with him that day. I was like, hey, man, I missed the class. Can you just help me out and tell me what's going to be on the test? And he's like, bro, the test was today. And my heart sunk. Like literally, here's what was bad about this, okay? We had 2 tests for the whole year. If I would have gotten 100 on the last test, I still would have gotten a 50 and failed. My stomach, I was like, oh my gosh, what do I do? So I decided to take the walk of shame to my professor's office to ask if there was, I had just looked wrong on my syllabus, I guess, and I didn't even believe my friend at first. You're joking with me, stop, right? He's like, no, bro, it really was today. I get to the door of my professor's office, don't know what he's gonna say, and like mid-sentence, I'm about to ask if I can make it up, and he's like, makeup test on Thursday, and I'm like, oh my gosh, thank you so much, thank you so much. I want you to think about that for a moment. That grace that he didn't even ask why, he just let me do it. He just let me retake the test. He didn't say, how bad do you feel? Will you never sleep in again? And he just is like, hey, makeup test on Thursday, you'll be able to take it then. I want you to think about that for a moment. That grace that he didn't have to give was a game changer for me. If he wouldn't have given me that grace, I would have failed the class, would have had to take the class again, would have had to face my dad because he paid for the class. That would have probably been the worst. Maybe even had to go to summer school, whatever. But because of his grace, I was able to retake the test and I passed. You remember last week, if you were here, Pastor Julian talked about pastor nightmares. And I have those too at times, because obviously I'm a pastor, but I still have nightmares at times about this, not about this class, but about failing, and did I not graduate, and all of these types of things. But anyway, my professor's grace helped me. And Pastor Julian last week talked about the church we see. And he started talking about how we're a family on mission. And that mission being, you might want to put up the slide, that mission being, our mission is to help people know God, find freedom, discover purpose, and make a difference. You see, the church we see helps people. The church we see is gracious towards others. They give people a chance even when they don't deserve it. See, maybe you're not confident. You could be like, man, I don't know how to help people know God. I don't know how to help people find freedom, but you can be gracious towards others. You can help people. And as we're discovering what that looks like, what better person to look at that was gracious towards people, that wanted to help people than Jesus. So we're going to look at a story today, and there was this group of people that brought Jesus this woman that was caught in adultery. And some of the people in that group were the Pharisees. And the Pharisees were, oh my gosh, they were a very, very strict people. Jesus was often very, they had a very strict observance to Mosaic law and some of God's laws. And Jesus was upset at them at times because they would push people away from God. Just by being so strict, they'd push people away from God instead of draw people to God. And so they bring this woman to Jesus. And it's just such a bad situation. She's being publicly humiliated. Jesus was teaching at the time that this happened. It would be like, someone coming in here, putting a person up here and say, Pastor, what do you think about what this... It was a very public, humiliating thing that was happening in that moment to that woman. And they remind Jesus, being the good law-abiding citizens that they were, they remind Jesus that if someone's caught in adultery, they should be stoned. And then they ask Jesus, what do we do about this, Jesus? Now, Jesus was in a really sticky situation. If he says to not stone her, they would accuse him of not following the Mosaic law, which was part of God's law. And if he did say stone her, they could report him to the Romans, because the Romans didn't allow Jews to carry out their own executions. And so they were really trying to trap Jesus in this moment. Let's find out what Jesus would do with this messy situation. In John 8, it says this: when they kept on questioning him, he straightened up and said to them, "Let any of you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her." What an interesting response by Jesus. He doesn't condone what she's done. He's not sweeping it under the carpet. She actually did do something wrong. I think all of us in this room, and even many in the world, would agree that you shouldn't go around sleeping with other people's spouses, right? That's not it's like, hey, thanks for doing that with my spouse. Do it again. That's not, she really did do something wrong. His statement didn't condone what she did. It's very interesting, though. His statement, though, disqualifies every single person from being able to throw a stone at her. Listen to see how the crowd responded to that. Down in verse 9 it says, "At this, those who heard began to go away one at a time, the older ones first, until only Jesus was left, with the woman still standing there." You see, what Jesus was doing, one of the things he was doing is, instead of them looking at the woman, he wanted them to look within. Instead of looking at what the woman did, even though it was wrong, he was wanting them to look within. I remember one time when I was really struggling with letting go of something, and I really was trying, and I just couldn't let it go. It was really hard. It was taking up too much of my mind and heart. And I remember almost the moment that I was able to let it go. And it was when God gently and lovingly, it wasn't condemningly and throwing in my face, he reminded me that I had done something similar in my life. And he reminded me that he let it go. And so it can be very effective if we're wanting to be gracious people to look within and stop looking around at what others are doing and look within and not for low self-esteem, I'm horrible, I'm crappy, but oh my gosh, I've done quite a bit too, and God, you forgave me as well. See, Jesus challenged them to look within because he was emphasizing grace, not judgment or consequences. Again, he didn't condone what she had done. He knew. But he was emphasizing something different than they were. And most times, not always, sometimes we can be our own worst enemy and we need to show grace to ourselves. And if you're that person, show grace to yourself, please. But oftentimes when we look in and we see our struggles, we're thinking about grace and not judgment and consequences. When I went to my professor, my goal wasn't to say, would you please judge me and give me the ultimate consequence of a 0? I just needed to hear it. Tell me I'm going to get a 50 in the final. I was going there to get grace. And when we look within, oftentimes, that's what we desire. And he was wanting them to look within because he was emphasizing something different. Let's continue in John 8. After the crowd had left, Jesus straightened up and asked her, "Woman." And how awesome is that? Instead of, "Hey, prostitute. Hey, adulterer. Hey, sinful person." Woman, a term of endearment, a term of humanity. Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you? No one, sir, she said. See, no one but Jesus remained. And even if you've never heard this real life story about Jesus before, you probably know how the story is going to end because we're talking about grace today. We see a gracious church. We see a church that helps people. That said, put yourself in the woman's shoes. She didn't know what he was going to do. You see, what they were doing to the woman she did do wrong, but what they were doing wasn't even fair. The law that they were trying to get Jesus to follow stated that both parties, the man and woman, needed to be there for there to be a case. But again, she did do something wrong. And Jesus had a case, could have spiritually had a case against her. On top of that, Jesus was the only one that could have thrown a stone. Do you remember his stipulation? If any of you is without sin, be the first one to cast it. Well, guess what? Guess who is standing in front of her? The person without sin. So I just wonder, the Bible doesn't tell us, but I wonder what the woman was thinking. And then Jesus responds to her. He says this, "Then neither do I condemn you. Go now and leave your life of sin." You know, I had this thought while preparing this message. Isn't it interesting? The people who weren't perfect wanted to condemn, but the perfect one wanted to give grace. He didn't say, before I give you grace, before I save your life, I just need to make sure of a couple things. You know that was wrong, correct? You know not to do that, correct? Jesus, why wouldn't you have done that? You just let her go. Is she just going to think that you're just this grace person that has no standards? Hey, you do know something, right? You're a home wrecker. Hey, you do know something. God's not pleased when we sleep around with people, right? That's obvious to you, right? Or you at least feel bad about this, right? He didn't say any of those things. He just lovingly looked at her and says, I don't condemn you either. He gave her grace and mercy. He freed her and then lovingly encouraged her to leave her life of sin. He freed her and then encouraged her to leave her life of sin. Not stop sinning and then I'll free you. He freed her. We see a gracious church, a church that helps others. You know, oftentimes people in the church look at the Pharisees as these evil people, but if they were, and they had problems, of course, just like every person walking this earth does, but if they were walking around today, they'd be very knowledgeable people and probably very law-abiding citizens. The problem is they weren't gracious people. For the Pharisees, morality and God's standards and rule-keeping got in the way of grace. And guess what? We have things that get in the way too. And I really want you to think about that for a moment. The question is going to even be up on the screen. What prevents you from giving grace to others? What prevents you from giving grace to others? Could it be morality and God's standards prevent you from giving grace to others? Now, are his standards important? Of course. Are they more important than grace? Of course not. Because if they would, we'd be saved through our morality. It doesn't say that in the Bible. It says we're saved by grace through faith, not morality by faith. Do you struggle to give grace because you're like, oh, they deserve it. They've made such a stupid decision. Is it hard for you to give grace when you see a person living or believing differently than you? How many times? Is it hard for you to give grace when you see incompetence? Call the government a couple times. You'll test your grace very quickly, right? Call customer service hotline, right? Is it hard to give grace when it costs you something? Yeah, I think that would be a hard one for all of us, right? Is it hard does pride ever get in the way? Nod the head. It's called just nod the chin. Yes, pride gets in the way. You know why it does? Pride fights grace. Pride often says that we don't need grace in the first place, and pride Pride, often tells us that we're better than others. And I said earlier that sometimes the best way to be gracious is when we look within and realize we need it in the first place. So pride can often fight grace. What about busyness? I know that might not, but just in this term, I don't have time to deal with this. That's what Jesus could have been like. You see, I'm in the middle of teaching people right now. Let's take care of this woman later. So sometimes it can even come down to, I don't have time to deal with it. Seriously though, I want you to take a moment and really think about that. What prevents you from giving grace to others? Because grace is crucial. Think about the story of Jesus again. If she would have not had grace, she would have died. But by giving grace to the woman, he helped and changed her outcome. She went free. Earlier in the message, I mentioned that if you're not confident with helping people know God or to find freedom yet, that you can help people by being gracious towards others. And that's just such a good start. But truthfully, when you're gracious with others, you are helping them know God. Because that's who God is. He's gracious. You're helping people know the heart of God. Jesus didn't go on with the sermon, do you know who God is and do you know this about God? But he definitely revealed the heart of God when he said, neither do I condemn you. And so actually, when we choose to be gracious and help people, we are revealing God's heart to others. And it's a very key step in helping them know God. Listen to this verse. It says it. I already kind of said it earlier. Ephesians 2. For it is by grace you've been saved through faith. That's why we're a gracious church. Because it's been given to us. And this is not from ourselves. It is the gift of God. So, go with me on this. If what saves any of us on this earth is God's grace, shouldn't grace be the thing that we show others and help them understand it the most? Shouldn't grace be the thing that we help people understand like the most? Like I'm gonna keep sharing grace with you until you get this. Because this is what my God is about. I said this earlier. Yes, God's standards are important. It's not as important as His grace. But what do we push on people? His standards, live right, or His grace, you can be forgiven. What do we push on people? The hot moral debate of the time? You believe that? How could you believe that? It says this in the Bible. Do we push those things on social media and other places, or grace? Do we push the social issue? Well, this is how I vote. How would Jesus vote? HJV bracelet. How would Jesus vote? HWJV. Guys, what are we pushing? Because most times, anytime we push the others, we're letting the world know what we're against. But when we push the grace button and we show the grace, we're showing them that we're still out for them, even with all their struggles, even with all their trials. Grace makes the difference. Here's what, I'm just going to give a few examples. I mean, there's millions of ways, and I hope God is speaking to you right now. Here's what giving grace may look like for you. Maybe it's giving a second chance to someone that made a mistake at work or made a mistake at school, and they don't deserve it. They don't. So just know that. They don't deserve it. But neither did we. Neither did we. Maybe it's helping someone that made that foolish decision. Oh man, and that's preventing you right now. It's incompetent. That is so unwise. Why are they making that decision? But maybe it's helping them anyway. Just like the woman, she didn't make a wise decision. Again, she made a decision that actually could have destroyed a family. This wasn't a no big deal. Maybe it's giving your spouse or a close family member the benefit of the doubt instead of assuming the worst. Maybe it's listening instead of lecturing. Maybe it's standing with them when no one else will. They don't deserve it. Neither did the woman. And Jesus was still standing with her when no one else would. Maybe it's, and this is probably the hardest one, maybe it's forgiving someone. And maybe and again, it doesn't mean you can't have boundaries. It doesn't mean the relationship has to be the same. But maybe your pain is preventing you from forgiving someone. And maybe it's just time to forgive. You know, this week I was reading an excerpt from a book, and the author of the book shares the story of a person that she was a prostitute, and she was very desperate and feeling a lot of hard things in her life, and she went to go get help from this rescue mission that helped down and out people, and she was just sharing her experiences and how down and out she felt and how desperate she was. And you know, the person had this really good idea to share with them about, hey, have you ever thought of going to get help from a church? True story. She looks at him and she's like, church? Why would I do that? I already feel bad enough. Why would I want to why would I want to feel worse? Now, we don't know if that woman, if this was just an assumption she had, or if someone in the church made her feel worse. But I do wonder, and God's the only one that knows, I wonder if her answer would have been different if she had met a Christ follower who showed her grace. And if she had met a Christ follower that showed her grace, that she's, good idea. Because when I went there the last time, someone showed me grace. You know, I'm thankful that OB1 is a church that gives grace and hope to people within our church and people within our city. There are many examples of us doing that, and we share that from time to time, and I know there will be more. But I also want to talk about us as individuals also. All of us, just like the woman caught in adultery and just like the woman that was struggling with whether she should go to a church or not to get help, all of us have people in our lives that need to see God's grace. Will they see it in you? Because people often have to see glimpses of something in other people for them to believe in God's love and grace. I'll give you one more example as we start to close here. And it's a very simple example. Robin and I were out for our 20-year anniversary a few years ago. Yes, I'm dating myself badly. And we just so happened to tell the waiter that, hey, it's our 20-year anniversary. Probably, asking if there was anything that you give for people that are 20 years. And genuinely, and I asked Robin just to make sure I remembered this correctly, genuinely, he looked at me and said, wow, maybe true love really does exist. Now, what just happened? This person saw a small glimpse of an evidence of love, and it made him think to himself, maybe this really is real. And just like the waiter saw an example of love, for others to believe in God's grace, they typically need to see glimpses of it in other people. The church we see is a gracious church. The church we see is a church that helps others. Let's be those people. Let's continue to be those people. As we close, actually, would you close your eyes and bow your heads? I want you to picture yourself as the woman in the story. Or again, maybe even in my situation, what I shared earlier. I want you to visualize, how would I feel if I was being publicly humiliated? How would I be desperate? You see, I believe most of us, probably all of us, if we were stuck in a situation where the stone was aimed at us, we'd want someone to give us grace. Let's do to others what we want others to do for us. We see a gracious church, a church that helps people. Can you take a moment, maybe for some of you today, as your heads are bowed and your eyes are closed, maybe it's just time to thank God all over again for His grace on your life. Maybe just it's starting there. We've talked about that the past several weeks, just getting back to the basics and just thanking God once again for the grace He's put on your life. But maybe with that, and again, it's not a throw in your face, it's not a condemnation, just like He did with me. It was very loving. Maybe He gently wants to remind you, hey, when it comes to other people, you've been sliding farther and farther from this concept of grace. That's what I've given to you. Would you give it to others? Help people know me simply by the grace you give to others. Help people. They need someone. You're my agent. You're my change agent.